managing the risks that may arise from their elevated numbers. So just a quick background, I guess. If we look across South Australia, there's lots of changes that have occurred since European settlement. We've seen lots of vegetation clearance, invasive species, which have affected a whole range of critters, and we've got a variety of species which could be classed as losers, the ones which have lost out in this deal because of their unique habitat requirements or the fact they can't cope with some of the introduced species. Conversely, we've got a range of species which, as the dust is settling, seem to be doing okay, and so these species we could say are the winners, the ones which seem to be coping in the current landscape. Included in that mix is a range of macropod species, so the western grey kangaroos, the red kangaroos and Euros all seem to be doing pretty well across South Australian landscapes. We've also got a couple of species which have smaller distributions, the eastern grey kangaroo and the Tama wallaby on a place like Kangaroo Island, where they're doing pretty well in those locations that they occur. So what's helping the kangaroos win? Well, if we look at some of the obvious things out there, we've got a big red squiggly line which represents the dingo fence. So the removal of dingoes from southern Australia to facilitate agricultural practices in that area means that it also removes a predator to macropods. So that's a very handy thing if you're a kangaroo. This is supported as well by a whole range of other baiting programs to put pressure on those predators for a whole range of reasons. So that's the reduced predation. Then we've got a whole variety of other things that are happening. We've got provision of water points over massive areas of the state, which dry state in the driest continent, kangaroos like to have a drink, so it's a big help for macropods. Similarly, we've converted a lot of habitats into pasture areas, which is a big thing for grazing animals like kangaroos. So we've got some increased resources in the landscape. Also, we've got quite a lot of change in community attitudes around kangaroos. So we've got that's a big thing in terms of the way people perceive kangaroos in the landscape. We've got a lot of, particularly in the Mount Lofty Ranges here, we've got a lot of people who use the landscape differently to how it has been in the past. So we've got a lot of lifestyle living. People have blocks of land, happy to have one of everything and a mob of kangaroos. So it's a good thing for kangaroos in those sort of environments. Absentee landholders across the state who have blocks and not managing them for any particular reason. So this results in effectively reduced management of kangaroos in lots of their range. So that's another thing which is pretty positive for the species in these southern areas. So what are the risks with increased kangaroo numbers? Well, most people are aware that you get elevated kangaroos they compete with pasture, so farmers are all going to be aware of that. So you've got more kangaroos in the paddock, they can compete with stock for grazing resources. You've got issues where kangaroos get in and impact on crops, commercial cereal crops, so consume those crops, and also orchardists where they get in and damage vineyards and trees and so on. So there's lots of issues around that. Also the infrastructure side of things where we're getting lots of kangaroos damaging netting on orchards, breaking through netting, and the usual things like fences as well. We've also got some increased concerns around public safety and kangaroo welfare itself. So just high numbers of kangaroos kangaroos on roads, and naturally more getting skittled. We've got issues where in recent times, this is 2010, where we've had elevated numbers of kangaroos here at Catarapco, and calls to manage these kangaroos because of welfare concerns. They've run out of tucker, and so concerns around the animal welfare side of things. Importantly, there's also quite a lot of risks with elevated numbers of kangaroos and the environment. So many people may not be aware, but kangaroos can have, or are having quite an impact on our landscapes, from right up in the pastoral country through mallee areas down to the higher rainfall parts of the state. So a lot of it can be quite subtle. So you've got an area there showing a bit of regenerating mallee. One side, kangaroos excluded, and grass present, other side no grass. So there's those sorts of subtle things where if you just look at the vegetation without having these comparisons, you might think it all looks pretty good. So there's lots of subtle stuff. And similarly, in the central image, we've got a fluorio swamp, and from the air you can see all the tracks that kangaroos are making through that swamp system. And it's not hard to go to a reserve now, just about any reserve in South Australia, and you come across these grazing impact studies where we trying to look at the difference between the total grazing pressure across the parks and reserves to see what impact particular species are having. So if we look at some of these risks, zoom in a bit further, these biodiversity risks, here's an example of a nationally endangered plant, the Mount Compass oak bush. The image on the left is one of the 1,200 remnant plants, which is being pummeled at the moment by kangaroos. So it's really impacting on that plant's ability to persist in the landscape. There's been work to recover the species, so seed have been collected, plants put in the ground in other reserves and roadside areas, and we're seeing it's very difficult to get these plants above a tree guard. They basically get munched off at the top. So it's quite a problem in terms of recovering the species, and that's leading to more extreme types of protection methods, so putting larger guards and more expensive fencing around these plants to get them back in the landscape. And of course, this is just work with a threatened species. We're not doing this with all plants in all areas of the state, so there's a lot of other non-threatened species which are being impacted, and it's just unsustainable to translate this sort of management across for all the different species you might have in a reserve. Similarly, we've got some nationally endangered fauna species, so I've just grabbed a group of species here. They're all heavily reliant on dense vegetation. Elevated kangaroo numbers can impact on that habitat quality by creating tracks through those areas, removing some of that dense vegetation and reducing the population or the viability of these species in some of those landscapes. So there's lots of biodiversity which are potentially at risk with elevated numbers of macropods. So these risks to species translate to ecological communities. So we've got problems around restoration that increases the cost of restoration. We're getting skewed regeneration in some of our reserves where you might have a she oak community not regenerating but other species coming in and regenerating in their space, so you're getting a bit of a skew. Particular concerns around post-fire recovery and what happens after fire and if the grazing pressure is too high. We have poor natural regeneration, lots of areas which could naturally regenerate but it's just not happening because of the grazing pressure, and in some areas we're seeing that unpalatable weed invasion. So as you might see in an overgrazed agricultural setting, we're seeing similar things in reserve systems where that grazing pressure is leading to these tough unpalatable plants coming in. So management on public reserves, the simple formula. So as you can imagine, it is a bit of a challenge managing on public reserves, and it has been happening for quite some time, so that recognition of need has been there for a long time, and so there is work happening, but there is a bit of a process that we go through in the public land system, and it basically requires the gathering of really good information on kangaroo numbers at a particular site and really good information on the impact, so quantitative information around both, and that's to I guess set this a best practice type approach to managing kangaroos. But is this a good way to go? I guess it's a costly exercise to work out how many kangaroos may be in a reserve, and it's also costly to work out the exact impacts that kangaroos are having on particular plants and the communities in general. So there are a lot of costs around it, and it's very time consuming to get this information about the impacts that are happening. So what's the risk? So if we look at kangaroos, what's the actual risk if we think about, do we need to get as much information about what's happening with those numbers on a particular reserve we're trying to manage? So this is just some stats about western greys, one of the species. They're considered least concern in South Australia and least concern nationally. The estimates in 2015 was around 1.5 million across South Australia, but that was just in the commercial harvest zone. So when you add on the other areas, it's probably up over the 2 million mark. And basically across all those, the majority of zones in South Australia, they're considered to be increasing. So flipping that on its head, what would it actually take to pose some risk to a species like this, which is doing really well? And basically you'd have to see a really significant reduction in population size or range. So you'd have to see them go from an area like Eyre Peninsula in a very short space of time to raise concerns in terms of a status rating for the species. And even then, the problem with having populations extend beyond the state borders means that they're coming back in from other states, which means the risk to the populations in South Australia is still very low. Okay, so just thinking about it in a different way, we've also had basically a 40-year trial. So across the landscapes in South Australia, there's been the destruction permit system where across private lands, people have been able to apply for a destruction permit based on their observations of kangaroo numbers. It's just an estimate they might have on a property. They describe the impacts, so having a problem with kangaroos on cropping land or so on, and then they detail the number that they wish to manage on those properties. And this has been happening over the state for the last 40 years. And fortunately, we haven't seen any contraction in range. We haven't seen any areas of them disappear from the landscape. And so this is, I guess, provides some insight into that less detail, how less detail might still not be a problem for this species in the state. And what basically happens, as you can imagine, is through lots of the landscapes, even on reserve systems where there is permission to manage, what usually happens is a bit of management effort goes into reduced numbers, but after a certain point, a certain threshold, management ceases because the effort is no longer, the time and effort is too expensive. Okay, so just wrapping up, the risk with the current approach, I guess, on reserves is that it's quite expensive. It actually takes a long time to get the information, so that it provides a bit of reduced capacity to be responsive to deal with issues as they arise. And this is particularly a problem for some of the threatened species in the landscape. The issue of not addressing the problem because of the timeliness and the cost of getting that information means that it eventually transfers the cost to some of these other projects like the threatened flora recovery projects where you have to expend more resources into protecting plants and populations. So that's some of the problems. And looking in a different way, we often focus in on what's happening with kangaroos in a particular site, when if we step back and look across the landscape, we can get a very interesting picture. So these photos of the golf course here are Barossa Golf Course. The interesting thing is that they're actually eastern grey kangaroos, not recorded from the Mount Lofty Ranges region. So what we're actually seeing is an expansion of eastern greys into the Mount Lofties. This is an example of the big picture stuff that's happening with some of our macropod species rather than the small picture stuff which might be happening on any one reserve. And likewise, where we work with some of our threatened macropods like these yellowfoots, we can focus on the animal and not necessarily pick up some of the impacts that might be happening around them. So looking at different resolutions. So what is the best way to manage overabundant macropods in the landscape? I guess that's the thing. I think it's time for potentially some blue sky thinking around it in the state and see what we can come up with and what's the best way forward to tackle things in the current situation. Thank you.
Beautiful. So we don't have any time for questions, but I'm sure Jason will be more than willing to field questions during the afternoon tea break.